I'm going to share 5 reasons why you as a local business owner should start a podcast. Also share 3 or 4 tips at the end to help you make a better podcast for your local business. I'm Bruce, host of the Smart Pizza Marketing Podcast and the Local Business Podcast, and I want to share a couple reasons why I think you should start a podcast. First, thank you so much for checking out the YouTube video. If you're listening to this on the YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening to this on the podcast, hit the subscribe button as well. We share tips, strategies, tactics, and guests to help you grow your local business here on YouTube and on the podcast. I started my podcasting journey back in 2015 with this podcast called the Smart Pizza Marketing Podcast. And my idea or my thought process behind that was, I'm going to start a podcast. I was a business owner at the time, working with my brother-in-law. And I said, you know what? We are having a hard time growing. What are these other business owners doing, or these other pizzeria owners doing to grow their business or find employees or manage the POS system or get new customers? What are they doing? I see them in the magazines. I see them at the trade shows, and they seem like they have it all figured out. So I said, you know what? If I start a podcast, that's a great way for me to have them join me on my show and be able to literally pick their brain and ask them questions for 30 or 45 minutes in an environment that I would not have had if I didn't have the podcast. I can invite them on, we have a call, and I literally get to ask them whatever questions I want for 30 or 45 minutes. Now, not everybody said yes, but this is a fantastic way to grow your network. And that's reason number 1. Grow your network. The network that you can attain by having a podcast is so much bigger than if you were to go out and network at meetings in your local area. The people that I've talked to on my podcasts, plural, I would never have had the chance to in real life. I just haven't had or come across them in real life yet. So if you want to build a network, start a podcast. Reason number 2, it's much easier than doing these videos. So like I said, we started our podcasting journey back in 2015. And I mean, I wish I started video back then, but I didn't. It's audio. All I needed was a crappy microphone, a little connection to my laptop, and I could literally through Skype have a conversation with somebody. So if you want to get started building your network, yes, video is great, and that's what we're doing here, but podcasting is so much easier to get started with audio and a laptop than setting up a camera, making sure you look right, making sure the lighting is okay, making sure that you record everything, and then you have to go and edit it. Yeah, a podcast you got to edit because you want to make sure that it sounds really well because people are listening to it in their car or on their walk and in their earbuds. But it's much easier to start a podcast and do the same thing or get the same goal with a podcast that you can with video. Number 3, it's a great way to learn. Just like number 1, growing your network, it is a great way to learn something by starting your own podcast. Like you're listening to this podcast right now, and whether you're listening to it on YouTube and you're watching it, or you're listening to it on the Local Business Podcast feed, you are trying to learn something, right? We do podcasts about LinkedIn, about Facebook ads, about Facebook Messenger marketing, teaching you how to do those certain things. Guess what? I am also learning as I'm doing the podcast. So sometimes for a podcast idea, I actually look at my friends or fellow speakers that I've had the chance to speak with, and I say, you know what? I really want to learn about Facebook Messenger marketing. Who could I get to join me on the podcast that could teach me about Facebook Messenger marketing and also teach you about Facebook Messenger marketing? So it's a fantastic way to learn. If you want to learn about podcasting, if you want to learn about Facebook ads, if you want to learn about Instagram, podcasting and having your own podcast is a fantastic way to get somebody to come on your podcast and give you free advice. Number 4, the difference between podcasts and video, like you're watching here, or if you're listening to the podcast, you're doing both. People can multitask while they're listening to a podcast. So when I first started the Smart Pizza Marketing Podcast, I did think about doing it on YouTube, but my audience was restaurant pizzeria owners who were working in their kitchens. And they just didn't have the time to sit down and listen or watch a 45-minute video interview. But they could put their earbuds in while they're making dough or while they're getting their bills paid or while they're doing office work and listen to my podcast while they do something else. So multitasking is a huge benefit of being able to listen to a podcast. You can go outside in the yard and listen to a podcast. You can go for a run or go to the gym and listen to a podcast. You can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, while you watch a YouTube video. So yes, YouTube is powerful and video is powerful, and we suggest often that you use video in your marketing. Starting a podcast and letting people be able to listen to your information while they do something else is a huge benefit to starting your own podcast. And then the fifth reason you should start a podcast, it's fantastic for building your personal brand. You've heard of that a ton lately. Build your personal brand, personal branding podcasts, personal branding YouTube channels. It's everywhere. But I highly recommend you start a podcast to build up that leverage of your personal brand. The amount of people who have found me or discovered me in our business, in our marketing company, or our mastermind group, or the courses that we do from discovering us on the podcast is almost 100%. We don't do very much digital advertising. It's all organic, and we don't do any offline marketing. Everything that we do comes from the podcast. It's been a great resource for our business. So if you're a local real estate agent or you are a local business owner, a podcast is a great way to get exposure for your personal brand and become that authority figure in your space that you always hear about. So to recap the 5 reasons why you should start a podcast. Number 1, build your network. And your network is huge. I can't stress it enough how important your network is to building the success of your business. Number 2, it's easier than doing video like this. Starting a podcast seems hard, but I'm telling you, if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. Number 3, it's a fantastic way to learn new things. Facebook ads or Instagram ads, or how to get better at TikTok, or how to start a podcast. Having a podcast is a great way to learn something that you've always wanted to learn. Number 4, people can multitask while they listen to your podcast, which means you can have a much larger audience. And number 5, it'll build your personal brand. That is really important. Just like your network, building the personal brand so people recognize you as the go-to person for whatever it is you're trying to teach is very, very valuable to your business, whatever your business is. All right, so those are my 5 reasons why you should start a podcast. Let me get into the 3 or 4 tips that I have from my 5+ years of podcasting that not a lot of people tell you. Like me, everybody tells you you should do a podcast. Not a lot of people tell you the pitfalls or the tips to do the podcast consistently over time. And that is exactly my number 1 tip is you have to be consistent. Trust me, I started a pizza podcast back in 2015 when podcasting was not as popular as it is today, and especially it wasn't as popular as it is today in the restaurant pizza industry. If I go to conferences, and I get the chance and opportunity to speak at a lot of conferences nowadays, back in 2015, I went to a conference with pizza operators, who was my main audience back then. And I said, raise your hand if you listen to podcasts. Out of a room of 100 people, 4 people probably would have raised their hands. And maybe 15 people would have actually known what a podcast is. Still to this day, in 2020, when I'm recording this podcast, pizza operators still think a podcast is something you watch on YouTube or Facebook, which it is kind of true, but a podcast in its natural form is a video podcast on iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher Radio or something like that. So they still, to this day, don't know what a podcast is. If I could give you a tip, it's going to take you a lot longer than you think it's going to. Nobody will listen in the beginning, and it's that consistency over time that builds up everything that I talk to in the first 5 reasons of why you should start a podcast. So if you do decide to start a podcast, just think about it in the long term. It's going to take you 6 to 12 months of consistently doing at least 1 podcast every single week before anybody really listens to you or it starts to gain traction. But if you can get to that point, I guarantee you it'll pay off. The tip number 2 is have 2 or 3 podcasts recorded ahead of time. If you do a weekly show, you don't want to get stuck in a scenario in which you are recording your podcast on a Monday or Tuesday that is going to go out on Thursday or Friday. You want to make sure that you always have 2 or 3 podcasts in the can, so to speak, that you could release if something happens. Especially if you do an interview podcast like I do. Yes, I do solo shows like this one, but the majority of the podcasts that we produce are interview based. And sometimes life gets in the way. either your life or your guest's life, and they can't always show up when they say they're supposed to. If there's one tip that I can give you, if you do a weekly show, make sure that you are 2 or 3 podcast episodes ahead. So if something does happen, boom, right in its place, you can add an episode because you already have it recorded and you could have it fit in seamlessly. Another tip that I didn't have on my list, but I'm going to mention you, is don't get too far ahead. The opposite thing can happen. In 2020, when this episode is coming out, earlier this year, we had something happen in 2020. I'm not going to mention it because I don't want this to go on YouTube or get banned, but something happened in the early 2020s. I probably had a dozen podcast episodes recorded for both of our podcasts that we have, the Smart Pizza Marketing Podcast and the Local Business Podcast. And what happened was the things that we talked about early in 2020 were no longer relevant because of what happened in March of 2020. I had to go back and ask all of those guests to redo the podcast because what we talked about at the time just wasn't relevant to the scenario that we were currently in. So back to my always be 2 or 3 ahead. You don't want to be 10 or 15 ahead because you never know what happens or what's going to happen in the future. And if you get too far ahead of yourself and something happens like it happened in 2020, all that hard work and all those episodes that you did could be gone forever. Just like when you are working in your local business, if you're a restaurant or a real estate agent, you're always recruiting. You're always looking for that next prospect. You are always doing the same thing when you are running a podcast. I am always on the lookout for a next guest, whether I'm online or I'm on Instagram or on Twitter or out in the real world. If there's somebody that I'm curious about that I think could provide value to the audience, I am going to ask them to be on the podcast. I am always on the lookout for a great guest to join me on the show. And that's something you have to be as well. You always have to be on the lookout. Just like you're always recruiting for your restaurant, you're always looking for new people who could join your team and help you out. I am always on the lookout for a great podcast guest. So if that could be another tip I give you, it's always be looking for that guest. Never let time go by where you're not searching out someone that could help you on your podcast. And number 4, and this was a big one for me in the beginning because I was a little bit nervous to ask people. Don't be afraid to ask people to be on your podcast, and don't get offended if they say no. When I started the Smart Pizza Marketing Podcast back in 2015, I asked a lot of people to be on the show, and there was a couple people that said no. And I was like, you know what? Why would they say no? I thought it was me. I thought it was the podcast. I thought it was a dumb idea. And it comes to find out that what I've learned over time is that when someone says no to being on your podcast, unless it's like a big person that you've asked and you've asked someone that's 100 steps ahead of you and they just literally don't have the time to do it. For the most part, if you're just starting out and you ask a guest to be on your podcast and they say no, I found over time, 9 times out of 10, it's not about your podcast. It's just about them maybe either being shy or really not having the time or just not interested in doing the podcast. That you can't get offended by that, and you can't let that deter you from asking other people. So if you ask someone to be on your podcast and they say no, don't get down about it. Just say, okay, maybe put them on the list so you can circle back to them in the future and go right on to the next one. Because I'm telling you, it isn't about you. It's more about them. All right, well, that's going to do it. I gave you some tips on why you should start a podcast and also some helpful tips on the things that I've learned from doing podcasts over the last 5 years. I hope that was valuable to you. I hope that was helpful to you. If it was, hit the subscribe button. We'll be sharing a lot more videos like this over the next few weeks. And also go check out our podcast if you are a restaurant owner. Check out that one. Or if you are a local business owner or a marketer for local businesses, check out that one. And let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? And if you have a podcast, tag it in the comments below. I want to see. Maybe I'll subscribe to your podcast, or maybe you could be a guest on mine, or I could come join you on yours. Let me know. I want to hear from you in the comments below, and we'll see you on the next video.